School here, Dr. Sal Mangione, and he, in addition to being a well-respected and excellent clinician as an internist and a pulmonologist, is a highly skilled medical educator. He's taught countless students in physical diagnosis. He's also, in his spare time, a bit of a medical historian, and he's going to talk to us this morning about why physicians sometimes do bad things, specifically reflecting on the Holocaust, Nazi medicine, and collective evil. So it's my privilege to welcome back my friend and colleague, Dr. Sal Mangione. Sal.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's really a real pleasure to be here, since I have so many friends that it's almost like being home. So thank you for having me. And let me tell you a little bit about this talk, which is kind of appropriate on the day after the Day of the Dead, as it is today. Why did I prepare this talk? I'm not Jewish, I'm a human being, and unfortunately our species has done a lot of this. And years ago I decided it was time to go and see the camps, which I think everyone should. And that kind of touched me and led to a lot of reading. Clearly, initially, I started reading about the perpetrators, and I discovered that we as physicians had done a lot of bad stuff. Then I started reading about the rescuers, because things had got so grim that I had to read about something more hopeful. And that's when I realized a little bit how the traits of the rescuers may not necessarily be fostered by our medical education. And that may explain why physicians were primarily perpetrators. So let's talk a little bit about this, which I called Nazi medicine, but in many ways is a talk on collective evil. I gave it this past May at the National Meeting of the American College of Physicians, and actually got a standing ovation. It's a longer version, the one I gave there, but I hope you like this. So on January 27, 1945, Auschwitz was liberated, and it became quite clear the extent of the disaster had been committed there. What you see here is Elie Wiesel. There was indeed at Auschwitz, although Wiesel actually was liberated at Buchenwald, because when the Russians were approaching the camp, everybody got moved west, and he was liberated at Buchenwald by the Americans. And actually, that picture that you see here was taken indeed there when the GIs arrived, and they brought in the brass. You see here Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton. And they're looking at the charred corpses of the prisoners. After this picture was taken, Patton went to a shack, stood behind it, and threw up. Eisenhower immediately released this memo to his staff. I want every American unit not actually in the front lines to see this place. We are told that the American soldier doesn't know what he's fighting for. Now at least he will know what he's fighting against. Bottom line is that nobody wanted to hear this stuff. This was the time of the end of the war, and people wanted to enjoy peace, go back to movies, and forget. And that's basically what the 50s were all about. And that is why Camus, the youngest Nobel Prize winner for literature after Kipling, got so outraged that he decided to write The Plague. The Plague is a metaphor for human evil. And he writes, "The plague bacillus never dies completely. It can lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chests. It can bide its time in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, bookshelves. And perhaps the day will come when, for the bane and the enlightenment of man, it will rise up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city." And that's because what is natural is the microbe. So this is really dark. What is normal to human beings is evil. And the rest, health, integrity, purity, if you like, is a product of the human will and of a vigilance that must never falter. And here's the conclusion. The good man, the man who infects hardly anyone, is the man who has the fewest lapses of attention. Now, what really put the Holocaust back on the map was the Eichmann trial. And Ben-Gurion knew that that was finally the way to talk about these issues. Then Hollywood immediately followed suit. We had Exodus in 1960. In 1978, this miniseries with a very young Meryl Streep came out, and I actually watched it as a medical student in Italy. Then in 1985, The Shoah, probably the best documentary I've ever watched on the Holocaust, came out. In 1988, the Holocaust Museum in Washington went up. Then 1993, Schindler's List, and 1998 is Roberto Benigni's Life is Beautiful. So what I want to cover today is this issue that the Holocaust is not an aberration of history. That's what human beings do, period. And that's the sad reality. Then the question becomes, why do we do it? And why we as physicians, faced with this kind of evil, may actually choose the wrong path. And lastly, what can we do to prevent another Holocaust and another evil of this sort? The problem is Holocaust fatigue. This is so bleak, so overwhelmingly negative, that many times when I give this talk, and I give it on every January 27 at Jefferson, because I think the med students need to hear it, I get med students that look at me like, why are you talking about that? It shatters our beliefs in God, in humanity, in governance, in altruism. It reminds us of a world without limits, with no ethical restraints, no religious restraints, no decency, no checks and balances. It reminds us that human beings are capable of doing anything to each other. And it finally tells us that given the right circumstances, it can happen again, anytime and anywhere. In fact, just read the news. So the conclusion could be as dark as the one of Primo Levi, who at 22, as a chemist, was taken by the Nazis to Auschwitz from Piedmont in Italy and wrote in If This Is a Man, and he was shortlisted for the Nobel Prize, on this earth there are sunrises, stars, skies, friendly faces, yet the planet is driven by a force not invincible, but perverse, which prefers disorder to order, madly to purity, knots to parallelism, rust to iron, and stupidity to reason. It seems that the world is heading for disaster, and we limit ourselves to hope that this advance can be slow. Which is nothing new, because 2,500 years ago, Euripides wrote, "Ours is a universe where justice is accidental and innocence no protection." And in fact, the conclusion could be the conclusion of the scholar of the Holocaust. There is nothing that can be learned from the Holocaust. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And this guy spent a lifetime studying it. And basically what he's saying is, there's nothing we can do about it. And I disagree. And I would like to quote these words that are also 2,500 years old. It will be enough for me, however, if these words of mine can be used by those that want to understand clearly the events that happened in the past, and which, being human nature what it is, will at some time or another, and very much in the same way, be repeated in the future. And this is Thucydides inventing history. His idea was that the disaster he had witnessed in his own city, Athens, self-combusting during the Peloponnesian War, had certain elements that could be learned. And so that by learning through history, we could prevent the repetition. In many ways, what Thucydides was doing was behaving like Machiavelli. He was an idealist without illusions. Machiavelli says, it would be wonderful if human beings could be angels. They're not. They are lions and they're wolves. And if we write a political science based on the wrong premise, we come to the wrong conclusion. So Thucydides agreed with that. In many ways, he was also behaving like a contemporary Athenians, actually not Athenians, a contemporary Greek, Hippocrates, trying to come up with symptoms and signs that could lead to a diagnosis and an early prognosis. So in many ways, they really were thinking like this person. How do people get to the point when they're murdering the grandmother next door? How does that happen? If we can start to understand it, then maybe we can figure out how to address the signs earlier. And this is not Thucydides, this is Angelina Jolie trying to make a movie on the Serbian massacre during the Yugoslavian Civil War. A movie that, by the way, was wonderful, but we never went to see because we prefer to see things where objects blow up in 3Ds. All right, so let's review. 6 million Jews got murdered during the Holocaust, but in reality, were 70 million people that got killed. And I'm talking about Poles, Romani, Soviet civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, people with disabilities, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and anyone who didn't fit the Nazi scheme. And there is an obligation to tell our children about it so it will never happen again. And it could be tempting to say, well, this was an aberration. These were some bad apples and the monolithic, obedient industrial might of Germany, and it will never happen again. So we're cool. Well, let me give you some facts. By the time the Russians liberated Auschwitz, January 27, 1945, and eventually took Berlin, 17 million German civilians were uprooted across Central and Eastern Europe from homes that had been their own for hundreds of years. We don't talk much about that. More than 2 million eventually will be killed or died of disease starvation. This was ethnic cleansing. The home of Virchow, the guy who invented pathology, is now ethnic cleansed. 2 million German women got raped by the Red Army, including the wife of Helmut Kohl, who went on to reunite Germany. And eventually she took her own life. She got gang raped by a group of Russian soldiers at the age of 16 and thrown out of the window of her apartment, and she eventually killed herself. And yet the Russians sat at Nuremberg as judges. So you could argue that when Roosevelt delivered half of Europe to Joseph Stalin for 50 years of slavery, and by the way, Roosevelt at Yalta had a blood pressure of 240 over 170. So, 60 million people died. That's the tally for World War II for 3 brains to get together and decide what to do. One has a blood pressure of 240 over 170. He's dazzled most of the meeting. He will die a few weeks later of a stroke. The other one is Winston Churchill, who at that time is on barbiturates and alcohol in industrial amounts, to the point that his own chief of staff says, the prime minister is out of it. So the only functioning brain is the paranoid brain of Joseph Stalin, and the rest is the Cold War. So World War II in Europe was not a victory of goodness, it was a stalemate. What about this never again? All right, let me just review the past century. And I would like to start it in Turkey. The Armenian genocide that gets you in jail if you mention it in Turkey to this day. In fact, Arm Pamuk, who won a Nobel Prize, was actually put on trial because he said, we committed genocide. We're talking about 1.5 million Armenians murdered. Then we go to Southeast Asia. This is the Cambodian killing fields. I was in medical school during that time. We're talking about 2 million dead. These were the others for political reasons, not for religious reasons. Then we go to Argentina. The Argentinians, the happy-go-lucky Argentinians, Italians who speak Spanish and think they're British. These guys, during the dirty war of the 70s, murdered 30,000 of their young. They narcotized them and they dropped them in the Mar de la Plata or in the ocean. Throughout South America, that period killed 60,000 people. Then we have the Middle East, which of course is a mess, and I'm not going to mention too much of it because it's an entire mess. I would like, however, to talk about the Sabra and Shatila massacres because the UN described them as a genocide. These were 3,000 Palestinian refugees. They were men, women, and children. They got slaughtered in their own camps by Christian Arab phalangists. Women were raped. Bodies were mutilated. Boys were castrated. Some were even scalped, and a few had Christian crosses carved on their bodies. The genocide was declared by the UN, and then, of course, it's not ending. This is the gassing by Assad of his own people, and we're all familiar with this picture. Then we go to Rwanda. We get students from Rwanda at Jefferson. And these guys didn't need, the industrial might of Germany to do what they did. They just did it with machetes. You could kill 1 million people with machetes, 20% of the population. Some of the students came up to me, and this is relatively well-educated and 90% Catholic Rwanda. They told me, in the morning they went to Mass, in the afternoon they came and killed us. Then there is Darfur, that is still going on. Then there is Europe. And Europe says, well, this is not us, we are civilized. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Bosnian genocide. When Yugoslavia went into self-combustion, in Bosnia, 200,000 people got killed, 12,000 were children, 2.2 million became refugees, 50,000 women got raped, and Srebrenica, where 8,000 people got killed in front of UN Dutch peacekeepers, is to this day the largest mass murder in Europe since World War II. Let me read you these lines and tell me whether this is a Nazi. What a good man who preferred a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, and filled with all the improvements that art can devise and industry can execute. And this is definitely not a Nazi, because this is President Jackson addressing Congress about the need for the manifest destiny, which means to seize millions of acres of Indian lands in the southeast. The Indians were relocated, and this led to many people dying along the famous Indian Trail of Tears March. President Jackson, of course, was responsible for it, but the whole conquest of the American West, with Wounded Knee Massacre being to this day the engagement where more Medal of Honors were awarded for action by the US Army, in many ways, the entire conquest of the American West is ethnic cleansing. And you could argue that today President Jackson would be in the jail of Slobodan Milosevic at The Hague instead of being on the $20 bill. When I was a kid in Italy, we were infatuated with American culture, and for Carnival, everybody wanted to dress up as a cowboy. And I take pride in the fact that since little, I used to dress up as an Indian, which basically means my penchant for always choosing the losing side. Well, after the Indians were the Chinese that had to go, and then, of course, became the civil rights movement, what Colin Powell called the American Second Civil War, and if you read the news, it's not ending. Now, it's the Mexicans and the Hispanics, and in Europe, it's the Muslims, to the point that Christoph wrote this editorial here in the US, and you're all familiar with these pictures. Now, Europe has a big problem because at least the US has a system in place to integrate immigrants to the point that within a generation creates an American. I have a daughter who's the daughter of 2 Italians, and she is as American as they come. So whenever I complain a little bit, she says, Dad, love it or leave it. And that's my daughter. And that's very good. But in Europe, they don't have that system. And now they're facing a humongous flow of immigrants. Will they be able to integrate them? And you know what happened in Paris recently. But this is not necessarily people that come from outside Europe. These are Romanian citizens. They happen to be Roma, and Sarkozy deported them. This is totally illegal. Romania is part of the EU, so they are free to move wherever they want. The EU did nothing. They simply say the French government deportation of Roma people is a disgrace, and nothing got done. All right, the Italians have this idea that they're nice people. We call it Italiani brava gente, Italians nice people. So let me tell you about the nice people. During the 1935-1936 invasion of Ethiopia by Mussolini, the Italian army deployed between 300 and 500 tons of mustard gas. This was totally forbidden. We had signed the agreement, and we killed 30,000 Ethiopians. But not only soldiers, we targeted civilians. In fact, we actually targeted Red Cross camps and ambulances. And Italian soldiers, like those pictures from Abu Ghraib, had themselves photographed around chests full of decapitated heads and next to cadavers hanging from gallows. And this is a picture that was in the news a couple of years ago. These are American Marines urinating on the dead bodies of Talibani soldiers. The guy in the center was actually a sergeant. He was interviewed recently. He says, I'm proud of that, and I would do it again. All right, so the bottom line, war is hell. From this picture of the last Jew in Vinica about to be shot by the Nazis to this Pulitzer Prize-winning picture from the Vietnam War, war is hell. And as E.O. Wilson from Harvard put it, it should not be thought that war, often accompanied by genocide, is a cultural artifact of a few societies, nor has it been an aberration of history, a result of the growing pains of our species. Wars and genocide have been universal and eternal, respecting no particular time or culture. Now, what is unique about the Holocaust is that the Germans did it. We're talking about the most sophisticated and educated population in Europe. And if they did it, then there is really no hope. Also, they did it with an undercurrent of pseudoscience, which brings us to the issue of physicians. Do you believe in the devil? You know, a supreme evil being dedicated to the temptation, corruption, and destruction of man? I'm not sure man needs the help. You just can't talk to animals about these things. All right, so what kind of an animal is man? There are two major schools of thought. One is Hobbes, as in Calvin and Hobbes, and that's pretty dark. By the way, he was a good friend of Harvey, the inventor, discoverer of circulation. The other one is a fellow physician, John Locke. Hobbes was convinced that things were pretty bad. Man is not a social animal, and the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In other words, society has to keep a tight control, otherwise everything unravels. Conversely, John Locke is an optimist. Man is a social animal. Human beings know right from wrong. They usually try to do right. Peace is the norm. Where did he get those ideas? Well, he had gone as an unpublished expatriate to the Netherlands, and he fell in love with the ideas of Spinoza, who by then had died, read all his books, and eventually put those ideas in his own books. 100 years later, men met in Philadelphia to create a new republic based on the ideas of Spinoza through Locke. In many ways, we're all children of Spinoza as Americans. So where is the truth? The truth, is, as always, is in the middle. We are both. The individual is capable of both great compassion and great indifference. He has it within his means to nurture the former and to outgrow the latter. And that's the challenge. Now, we are, in many ways, dragons. The dragon is present in all cultures because it's us. It's a snake that crawls through the muck and the mud of its daily existence, but also has wings, like angels, that allows him to soar above his miseries if he chooses to do so. And in many ways, this lithograph by Escher captured it. When you look at this first, the only thing you see are the demons. But if you squint, you start seeing that in between there are angels, and that's what we are. Now, this picture came out in 1960, which is when Hannah Arendt published her book, The Banality of Evil. And then she, for the first time, says, evil is pretty banal. We all could do it.
I don't believe in either the proposition man is evil or the proposition that man is good. I would say man has the capability of being either good or evil. And usually is something in between.
And that's the bottom line. We have the capacity to be good and evil, and usually we are something in between. So we can choose, which is why we need to talk about this. There are two studies that we all need to be familiar with, and incidentally, finally, Hollywood discovered them. There are movies now coming out on both of them. The first one is a study on the individual response to authority, direct authority. And the other one is the individual response to institutional authority. And interestingly enough, these studies were produced by two friends. One was Stanley Milgram, and the other one was Philip Zimbardo, so the son of immigrant Jews from Poland and the son of Italian immigrants from Sicily. Both of them went to the same high school in the Bronx. In fact, they were classmates. Now, Milgram wanted to study why the Germans had done what they did, but he didn't have the money to go to Germany. He was at Yale, and he decided to do a local study that could address the issue why human beings do this. So he advertised for it in the community, and he recruited regular folks from the Yale community, which means mostly white, middle class. He told them, we're going to do an experiment. We're trying to teach a learner how to learn by giving him a zap of electricity each time he makes a mistake. It's a Pavlovian reflex. You will be the subject that has to give, through this machine, a zap of electricity to the learner. And the learner, you can't see, it's on the other side, but you can hear his screams. And I'm going to sit next to you and tell you when to do it. Turns out that this was all a hoax because the learner was a confederate of the experimenter. So the real study was, will somebody told to give electricity in increasing amounts to someone he has never met will be willing to go all the way up to lethal discharges, even though the person is screaming? And the answer is yes. So the goal here, of course, was to test the influence of individual authority. The experimenter had a white coat and looked very serious. The number of voltages had increased, and the learner was instructed to bang on the wall, say, I have a cardiac condition, I can't take this. At that point, most subjects expressed a wish to stop. And they told the experimenter, maybe we should stop. At that point, the experimenter was supposed to say the following things. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It's absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. And if at that point the subject said, no, I'm not going to go on, then the experiment ended and the person got debriefed. Otherwise, they went all the way up to 3 times discharges of 450 volt shocks that basically left the subject, the learner, unresponsive, dead. Now, before conducting the experiment, Milgram, and by the way, no IRB who review and approve this thing nowadays, but Milgram basically polled senior students and colleagues and says, how many will go all the way? And they said, wow, maybe 1 to 2%. The reality, 65%. So basically, 2/3 of us, let's flip it. There is only 1/3 of us, and maybe even less, 20%, of glorified individualists that faced with this said, hell no, I won't do it, okay? Then he got concerned that maybe this might have been Yale, the impression of Yale. So he went to Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he did it in an unregistered backstreet office. Same results. Then he thought maybe it's men. Women gave the similar results. Then he figured out maybe we can do it in other countries. Meta-analysis showed that overall the numbers remained the same. 2/3 would do it, 1/3 would not. Then he went to Germany. And obedient Germans, 85% did it. Then he went to Australia, a country founded by convicts. Only 30% obeyed. This is actually very interesting because it tells us the importance of disobeying. Now, obedience to authority is the glue that makes for a working society, but it's also the glue that leads to a disaster. So there is an importance in disobeying when necessary. So Milgram concluded that ordinary people simply doing their jobs without any particular hostility on their part can become agents in a terrible destructive process. The bottom line is that the evil people in Nazi Germany were not that many, but everybody went along. All right, then Zimbardo goes to California, and he does the Stanford experiment. That's another one that will never be approved by an IRB, because basically the experiment consisted in getting college kids and say, half of you will be guards, half of you will be prisoners. It's testing Abu Ghraib. This is Abu Ghraib. This is institutional evil, okay? You get regular people, you put them in a place like Abu Ghraib, what happens? And it's not bad apples. This is bad apple barrels. So what he got was mostly white, middle-class, very adjusted kids, and he randomized them into the 2 groups. He told the guards, the goal here is to dehumanize, de-individualize. I'm going to give you batons, clothing, so you have a uniform. That's why I resent white coats, and I don't wear a white coat, because that's a uniform. And we know that societies that go to war with a uniform are much more likely to do mischief than societies that go to war without war paints or uniforms. So I think, frankly, the lab coat has to go. In fact, it's dirty. The Brits have abolished it because it's a carrier of bacteria, but may even do something in separating us from the patient. The bottom line is that evil became immediately evident. Notice actually how degrading were the rituals to the prisoners. That paperback we've seen a lot in pictures on our papers recently. They were only referred to by numbers. They were shackled to the ankles. And he oriented the guards, and he told them, we're going to take away their individuality in various ways. In this situation, we have all the power, they have none. Things got so quickly out of hand that the guards became increasingly cruel and sound clearly sadistic. 1/3 became sadistic, and Zimbardo got scared. He stopped the experiment very quickly at 6 days instead of the 14 he had originally planned. Interesting enough, the guards got upset. They were having a good time. The prisoners suffered, and they accepted sadistic, humiliating treatments, and many of these got pretty damaged in the process. So what Zimbardo writes in this book, and of course it's the summa of all his studies, is that if you have an ideology and you have a place that goes bad, lots of bad stuff can happen. So we're talking about institutional authority, which could be national authority. You could be working for an institution that is evil. I used to work at the Medical College of Pennsylvania that imploded when we got an evil leadership, and none of us spoke up. So that's why when Abu Ghraib broke out, Zimbardo said, that's my experiment, and he volunteered to defend the prison guard. And when they started talking about bad apples, he said, no, this is not bad apples, this is bad barrels. In fact, this is bad barrel makers. Now, we know now that except for the sexual abuses at Abu Ghraib, everything else had been directly ordered by Donald Rumsfeld. And yet, he didn't go to trial. No officers went to trial. All right, so the point is Antigones. When Sophocles wrote Antigones, he was witnessing the implosion of democratic Athens into a totalitarian state. And remember the story of Antigone. She has two brothers. There is a civil war. One fights for the king, the other one fights against. They both die. The one that fought for the power and the state is given a beautiful funeral. The other one is left out the walls to rot. And she says, the law of God requires me to give him burial. And she's willing to go to her executions because the laws of God are more important than the laws of the land. So there is this issue of praising disobedience. This book that was written by an Israeli physician and a French director is only available in French and in Italian and in Spanish, not in German and not in English. And I think it says a lot about the different way of being a society. Disobedience is not seen too well in our societies, but maybe it should. Just think of what happened to Snowden. And we have a tradition of civil disobedience. Eric Fromm wrote poignantly about it. Human history began with an act of disobedience, and it's not unlikely that it will be terminated by an act of obedience. In fact, at this point in history, he writes, the capacity to doubt, to criticize, to disobey may be all that stands between a future for mankind and the end of civilization. All right, so let me show you an example of this, why people don't speak up. This is Kristallnacht. It's 1938. It's only 1 year away from disaster. This is the first time most Germans realize they are led by a bunch of nutcases, evil nutcases. And these are the regular Germans. And this person was interviewed.
Wenn die Massen schreien, Heil, und wer konnte der eigentlich ausrichten? Dann ist er nicht. Wir waren die Mitläufer. Wir waren die Mitläufer.
When the masses are shouting Heil, how you can say nine? I hate the bystanders. I can't stand their whining of innocence. I hold each of them accountable for the job that life asked of them and keeps asking them daily. I hold them responsible for what they have done, and more importantly, for what they have not done. In this, I'm merciless. I can't waste my compassion, and I can't share my tears. I'm a man of commitment, and thus loathe those who refuse to commit. I hate the bystanders. By the way, Dante puts them in hell, the worst part of hell, the bystanders, the ones who can't commit. All right, so why it happens? These are some personal ideas. Clearly, you need a society that has relatively blind obedience to authority. So you need group, herd, flock psychology. A society that is anarchoid and chaotic is probably not going to do it in that kind of way. Then you need a trigger. That means usually a humiliated, threatened nation. What's going on in the Middle East now is a civil war disaster. What happened in Germany after World War I was an economic implosion. You need a trigger. Then you need scapegoats, and typically they get dehumanized, very much like in the Zimbardo experiment, to the point that they are called nothing but dehumanized. They're called vermin, microbes, cockroaches, snakes. Then you need an evil leadership, and more importantly, you need the silence of the good guys. You need indifference. To the point that Martin Luther King very well put it, I don't fear the shouts of evil. I fear the silence of goodness. And Kershaw, who wrote a wonderful biography on Adolf Hitler, said the path to Auschwitz was paved with indifference. Indifferenza is actually the word that has been sculpted in the Milan train station that took lots of Italians to Auschwitz. So genocide, in many ways, is the ultimate shortcut to a lost Eden. If there is a course to the human condition, is to have lost oneness. Maybe if there is an afterlife, we will regain it. But during this life, we try to achieve it through shortcuts, through sex, through drugs, through alcohol, through political unit, through religion. Remember, the word religo is Latin for to bind, to make one. We want to feel one. But there is also a very good, healthy way to do it, and it's through love. The unhealthy is through hate, which basically means you're not one of us, and if I can eliminate you, then we will all be blonde hair and blue-eyed, and we will be happy. So oneness, not through love and beauty, but through hate and violence. This SS wrote, joining the SS was to become part of an elite, an aristocracy, a religious order, a secret society, a gang, an army, a family, a cult, all at the same time. He's basically saying he meant to become one. Comradeship was everything. It gave us the mental and physical strength to do what others were too weak to do. So life is a joiner, and that's why Edward Wilson writes in this book on our species, which is wonderful, that group psychology is good in small amounts. That's how we took over the planet, because cohesion leads to success, but it can also lead to conformity, and conformity is the undercurrent of evil, and that's what we need to steer away from it. This former chief rabbi of the UK put it very well. We need to have the courage not to conform when necessary, once again, in praise of disobedience. Now, when things go bad, we divide up in 4 groups. There are going to be perpetrators, there are going to be victims, there are going to be a lot of bystanders, indifference, and finally, there are some glorious individualists who will resist and rescue. And I want to tell you about these because they are the ones who need to take as models. First of all, Germany had quite a few. Many resistors, some rescuers. If you want to see something that lifts your spirit, watch this Oscar-nominated documentary called A Restless Conscience on the good Germans who resisted. And actually, I got so blown away when I watched it that I Googled the author, and I discovered she was in New York. And her name is Ava Beller, and so I went there to talk to her. She was a dancer in New York, married to a psychiatrist, and she said, I went to a dinner party, and a woman was there, and she was German, I'm German, and I said, where's your family? They said, oh, they all got killed by Hitler. Oh, they were Jew. No, they were not Jews. They were resistors. And she said, what do you mean? There were resistors in Germany? She said, absolutely. So she quit everything and moved to Germany on her own. She supported herself as a waiter, interviewed them all before they died out. And that is an amazing documentary. We're talking about this picture, which I keep framed in my home. That's a resistor. But I want to tell you about the rescuers, which are a little different. So what motivates them? If you read their biography, and Yad Vashem publishes them all, there are 22,000 righteous Gentiles who did the right thing. When you read their biographies, they are mostly outsiders who can view life in a wide array of grays rather than black and whites. They not only were compassionate, but they were willing to act upon it, and they were so independent-minded to be basically a religion and a party of one. And lastly, they were blessed with an amiable disregard for rules and authority, which is this in praise of disobedience. So these were free thinkers. We are not that way, let's face it. We tend to be primarily mainstream. We're often intolerant of ambiguity. Lots has been written in our literature. We're conservative. We're prone to authoritarianism. And we lose empathy. Jefferson has published a lot as a result of going through training. So we really don't have those ingredients. However, we have the ingredients of being good citizens in time of stability. But in time of distress, this may lead us to do the bad stuff. And that's what we need to talk about. It's basically this duality of the left brain and the right brain. The right brain allows you to see the forest, the left allows you to see the trees, and medical school fosters the left brain and stifles the right. Osler put it pretty well. No human being is constituted to know the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Try to tell that to a kid who has to take a multiple choice exam where there's only one truth. And even the best of men must be content with fragments, with partial glimpses, never the full fruition. So maybe that's how we produce Mengele. And of course, the results were disastrous. They went to trial. A British foreign officer wrote home, over 90% of the members of the medical profession in Germany at the highest level were involved in one way or another in work carried out in hospitals, universities, and concentration camps involving experiments on human beings in which the subject was either sacrificed or permanently wounded. And in fact, just now in Berlin, they opened another monument to the German citizens who got basically euthanized by Nazi eugenics. So they went to trial. This was an American military tribunal, 1946, only 23 leading German physicians and administrators. Crimes against humanity, euthanasia program in Germany, the eugenics, and then of course what they did in the camps. Now, they inoculated prisoners with typhus. Remember, typhus was killing more German soldiers in Russia than Russian bullets. So that's why they were doing human experimentation. Victims were Poles, Russians, Jews, Gypsies. Many died, others were crippled. So 140 days of proceedings. In the end, 16 of the 23 are found guilty, 7 are sent to death. They all get executed. None of them expresses guilt or remorse. And that's the end of it. So 23 out of this humongous medical industrial machine. Back home, we were having Tuskegee, which was not that different. And more importantly, we had the Guatemalan experiment. This only came out recently, and frankly, you really had a hard time reading it on the American press. Much of my information comes from the BBC. So what was the Guatemalan experiment? A woman from Wellesley was investigating Tuskegee, and she stumbled upon the fact that very much at the same time American judges were sending German physicians to the gallows, American physicians from the Department of Public Health had made a deal with the Guatemalan government to inject with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid Guatemalan citizens. We're talking about inmates, we're talking about soldiers, we're talking about people in mental institutions. They were trying to figure out if penicillin worked so they could use it on the GIs deployed abroad. And we're talking about germs injected into the eyes, the CNS, the genitalia. So she found out and went public. Obama had to apologize, and the BBC wrote a lot about it. We're talking about close to 3,000 innocent people injected by physicians from the Department of Public Health. And Obama said, I'm sorry, and recently a lawsuit was dismissed in Washington, D.C., so nobody got a penny for this. If you want to read about it, it's actually on the web as a PDF, as a report to Congress. So you could argue that in Nuremberg, there were American judges whose physicians were doing exactly the same thing that German physicians did to the Jews, and then there were Russian judges whose soldiers had raped 2 million German women, and this puts a totally different spin on the tale of the mote and the beam. Why that? Well, it's because Darwin led to eugenics. Eugenics was actually founded by a relative of Darwin, which basically initially said sterilization. Let's not have them reproduce. Hitler took it over and moved it to the next step, which is let's kill them. And eventually this moved to let's kill all the ones that don't fit. Let's weed the species. Let me read you this, and this is not a Nazi. It's better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offsprings for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is as broad to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And this is Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Chief Justice, writing this decision where the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of a Virginia law that allowed for compulsory sterilization of patients in mental institutions. And indeed, this was going on all over the place here. We were leading the movement of eugenics to the point that Hitler in Mein Kampf praises the American government and then takes it to the next step. So eugenics is born in 1883. By the end, here in America, which was when I graduated, 60,000 Americans have been forcefully sterilized. Hitler praised this in Mein Kampf and took it to the next step. What is interesting is that here in the US, 1/3 of all forced sterilizations were actually carried out after Nuremberg. In fact, everything got repealed only in 1979, which is the year before I graduated, because some women in California sued the state with a class action suit for coercing them into tubal ligation after delivery, and that's how it ended. Now in Canada, it ended in 72, and in Sweden, they sterilized more people than any other European country other than Germany. They ended in 75. In Sweden, very little compensation has been paid. Why is this relevant? Because we're getting there again. Now, we're not going to kill them. We're just going to prevent them from being born. And if you want to see something very interesting, and I show it to our students as part of our movie club, see Gattaca, a movie made by a New Zealand director and written by him. It's on a brave new world where you can come into life either through the luck of the draw or because you are genetically manipulated as the Ubermensch. And we're coming to a point where Woody Guthrie will not be allowed to be born. And that scares the daylight out of me. I have family members who in a Gattaca world would not have a chance, and the universe is a much better place because they're in it. So why are we at risk? We're authoritarian. We have conservative views. We lose empathy. We are intolerant of ambiguity, and that is part of the reason. This is Osler again. A distressing feature in the life of which you're about to enter is the uncertainty, which pertains not alone to our science and art, but also to the very hopes and fears which make us men. In seeking out the absolute truth, we aim the unattainable. We must be content with finding broken portions. This is Equanimitas, his parting speech at Penn before going to England. So let's talk about the truth. The truth is a rabbit in a bramble patch. And the most you can do is to circle around, point, and say it's somewhere in there. You can't touch it. You can't put your hands on that furry, quivering body. And that's Pete Seeger. My favorite exhortation to tolerate the gray, the ambiguous, comes from the guy who wrote most of Fellini's scripts, Ennio Flaiano. When I was young, I thought that the opposite of a truth was necessarily a lie, and the opposite of a lie necessarily a truth. Now that I'm older, I'm starting to wonder whether the opposite of a truth might be another truth, and the opposite of a lie might be another lie. By the way, the Greeks invented theater to foster tolerance of ambiguity, which they thought was necessary to a democratic society, and that's why when societies go to totalitarians, the first casualty is usually theater. All right, so could be good to be tolerant of ambiguity. If we are intolerant, we view the world in black and white. But if we are tolerant, we're more open. We may look at different options. We may cope better with difficult situations. Bottom line, it would be desirable to be tolerant, but we're not. Some demographics. Physicians become anxious when confronted with uncertainties. And this is more likely to be a problem of internists versus family docs. Younger and male students versus older and female students. Students that come from the sciences versus students that come from the humanities. And it's getting worse because they have compared data from the 80s with data from the 60s. It can even cause you to choose a different career. If you're intolerant of ambiguity, you're more likely to go where you think there is certainty, like, for example, anesthesia, surgery, radiology. Conversely, the most tolerant go into the gray, which is psychiatry and primary care. And again, a lot of kids who are intolerant become very anxious when they're dealing with very gray situations, like the drug addict, the one with chronic pain, the psychosomatic. So this is so important that it leads to even greater use of resources. The intolerant of ambiguity write for more tests. They cost more to the system. And that's why some medical schools have advocated testing for it. This was a paper published a year ago in Academic Medicine by Gail Geller from Hopkins, and she says we have scales for it. They should not be allowed in. Intolerance of ambiguity is also the mark of an authoritarian personality. This is Adorno writing after the Holocaust. And an authoritarian personality is a person that has intolerance of ambiguity, and in his own study is also anti-Semitic. They all go together. This may explain why we were the most Nazified profession in Germany. 1 out of 2 was a member of the party. Okay, so authoritarianism. This is a study by Merrill at Baylor. 1 out of 5 students was authoritarian. This increased quite significantly during medical school. Seniors were 30% more intolerant than freshmen. The greatest increase was in women, even though women remained more tolerant than men. And this became even higher than students in law schools. So medical school makes us intolerant, gives us a black and white. Think about all those multiple choice tests. Beautiful article by Abigail Zuger in the New York Times, and she's a very good physician. Life is not a multiple choice exam. Now, more authoritarians go where the intolerant of ambiguity go. Radiology, anesthesia, surgery, pathology. The least authoritarian go into primary care and psych. So again, the need to foster that. So maybe that's how we produced him. And him, this is Wegener, who experimented on Jews in the ghetto of Lodz. So that's why we don't call this syndrome anymore Wegener syndrome. And then there is Ryder. We don't call that Ryder's arthritis. We call it reactive arthritis. He was a Nazi. Kind of looks like a Nazi, doesn't it? And then there is this. All right, so let me talk briefly about that. I'm coming towards the end. When I was in medical school, I wanted to buy this book because this was the best atlas. JAMA called it a classic among anatomical atlases, one of the most important atlases since Vesalius. It's beautiful. And yet, this is the product of artists working on cadavers of people executed in Nazi prisons. This particular fellow even changes SS letters in his name as the runes of the Nazis. So all of these guys were proud Nazis. Karen Tresser is the fellow who used the SS runes for his signature, although the publisher has now airbrushed them so you can't really see it. And another guy put a swastika after his name. This was all based on 800 corpses sent for dissection to Vienna from prisons in Vienna, but also in Prague and in Munich. So this is an atlas with blood on its pages. And in fact, has been written a lot that this should not be used. Let me tell you about the man who produced that. He became the dean at the University of Vienna, and this was his inauguration speech. To the students, you're called to assume the medical care of the people who have been entrusted upon you, not only in the positive sense of furthering the propagation of the fit, but also in the negative sense of eliminating the unfit. The methods by which racial hygiene proceeds are well known to you. Control marriage, propagate the genetically fit whose genetic biologic constitution promises healthy descendants, discourage breeding by individuals who do not belong together and whose races clash, and finally exclude the genetically inferior from future generations by sterilization and other means. So that's Edwin Pernkopf. You see the Nazi lapel. He was one of the earliest members of the Nazi party in Vienna, wore the Nazi uniform whenever he could. And immediately after he became dean, he fired 153 out of 197 faculty members, including 4 Nobel laureates, because of their Jewish religion. Most of these folks either went to the camps or had to emigrate and never got their job back. So basically, this was a humongous lobotomy of what at that time was the best medical school. And this article, written by a German physician who was now Jewish, is in the Annals of Internal Medicine, and it tells you what this kind of stuff can do. Then there is Guantanamo. There were physicians in Guantanamo who decided when waterboarding had to end. And this was never prosecuted by us. And in fact, this editorial in the New York Times was wondering why we didn't prosecute them. Then, of course, there are physicians behind the lethal injection. And let's put a little bit of light. There are good physicians. So let me give you an alternative here, and this is Albert Schweitzer. To my chagrin, I realized that not a single one of my medical students, 257 of them, knows who Albert Schweitzer was. Then I asked if they knew who Lady Gaga is, and everybody did. So let me tell you about him. He's one of my heroes. Schweitzer was a theologian and probably the best musician for Bach organ music of his time. At the age of 33, he was so distraught by what his fellow Europeans had done to Africa and its people that he decided to leave everything, become a medical student, earn a degree, and go to Africa. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for it, but he was more into reverence for life. We need to respect all forms of life. In Africa, his best friend was Parsifal the pelican and Pansy the cat. And I'm going to show you this thing. This was a group of chimps that had been kidnapped in Africa, kept close, and finally liberated after 20 years. It's the first time they see the light. They're hugging each other. They're tentative. And then one very courageous steps into the light. The point is, the rate of death of animal species on the planet is 1,000 times higher than what it should be, and that's because of human activities. So we need to think about that too. So if Hannah Arendt gave us the banality of evil, let's talk about the banality of goodness. What can we do as regular human beings? And I want to give you one story, because I stumbled upon it by chance. I knew nothing about this guy. He happens to be a fellow Italian, so got brownie points in my view. But it's the story of any of the 22,000 righteous Gentiles. Who was Giorgio Perlasca? He was a normal guy who, once put in an abnormal circumstance, raised to the circumstance, and it's called heroic imagination. So the banality of goodness. He was a hothead. He was a fascist. He hated the communists. He volunteered in Spain to fight for Franco. His leader was an Italian Jew. He was not anti-Semitic at all. After the war, went back and got appalled when Mussolini passed racial laws. So he did not volunteer for World War II. But he was working for a company that procured meat for the Italian government. And he found himself in Budapest when Italy surrendered. And he became an alien. And Budapest was teeming with Nazis. So he went to the Spanish embassy, because he still had the document that he fought for Franco. And the ambassador said, sure, we can give you a passport, you can go back to Italy, but we're pretty busy here, because we're trying to save all these Jews that Eichmann wants to deport. We pretend that they are our citizens, we have safe homes. Would you like to help out? And Perlasca was a strapping six-footer, and he was a soldier, said, sure. He was blonde hair, blue-eyed, and he started basically going to rounds and bringing food to these folks. There were 5,000 in homes kept by the Spanish embassy. And he tried to reassure them. Things got so bad eventually that the embassy closed, and the ambassador left. Perlasca said, what's going to happen to these people? And the ambassador, before leaving, said, Giorgio, do the best you can. So one day he was doing his rounds, and the Nazis came in and started rounding up people. And Perlasca went to the SS office and said, you can't do that. And the officer said, who are you? And he said that in a moment, he had this flash, and he said, I'm Jorge Perlasca. I'm the Spanish consul. At that time, Budapest had been surrounded by the Russians, so he could keep that jig for 3 weeks. And by cheating, by bribing, by blackmailing, he basically saved 5,000 people. And then he went back home and never talked about it. Years later, the women he had saved decided to find him out in Spain, and they realized he was in Padua, Italy, and he became a celebrity. Italy gave him a stamp. He's remembered in Budapest. His name is among the people that saved the Jews in Budapest. He is at Yad Vashem. Just before dying, he was interviewed, and he said, and these are very important words, I saw women and children being killed, and I could not remain idle. What would have you done in my place? Now, before dying, Bobby Kennedy said, I think back to what Camus wrote about the fact that ours is a world in which children suffer and they get tortured. And maybe this will always happen. But at least we can lessen the number of suffering children. And if we don't do that, who will do it? Now, when I gave this speech in Wellington, New Zealand, the director of the Holocaust Museum there wrote me a beautiful email, and he said, I was touched by your speech, especially because you mentioned Perlaska. Without Perlaska, I would not be here. My mother was one of the women from Budapest he saved. All of this to say, the life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Strangely enough, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And in turn, you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the way the world is made. I didn't make it that way. This is the interrelated structure of reality. And this is Martin Luther King. And then he goes on to say, in the end, we must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. All right, last slide. Always be a party and a religion of one. It seems pretty clear that the group is the undercurrent for evil. So you got to be able to stand out and ask yourself, is this right? When the pyres go up, always side with the witches. When the beast finally rears its ugly head again, which based on history will, try to find the moral courage not to be a perpetrator, not to be a victim, not to be a bystander, and hopefully to be a resistor and a rescuer. Hence the need to talk about it. Now, Karl Jaspers, who was not a Jew, although he was married to a Jewish woman, wrote this book after the war, and he writes, that which has happened is a warning. To forget it is guilt. It must be continuously remembered. It was possible for this to happen, and it remains possible for this to happen again at any minute. Only in knowledge it can be prevented. That's why recently Academic Medicine published this article about the need to talk about the Holocaust in medical curriculum. I'm going to finish with this, and I want you to look at that, and unfortunately it's not that clear because there is light, but I want you to see this amazing picture of Saturn taken by Cassini. The command station in Houston, in Pasadena, told it to position itself just behind the planet. So you see the backlit rings, but there is a teeny tiny little pale blue dot here. See that? You know what that is? That's us. Okay? And here is what Carl Sagan writes about this, and these are my last words. From this distant vantage point, the Earth might not seem of particular interest, but for us, it's different. Consider again that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering. Thousands of confident religions, ideologies, economic doctrines. Every hunter and forager, hero and coward, creator and destroyer of civilization. Every king and peasant, young couple in love, mother and father, hopeful child, inventor, explorer, teacher of morals, corrupt politician, superstar, every supreme leader. Every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of that dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic darkness. In its obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. So this is a packed talk. Sorry, I took the full hour, but thank you again for having me. And if you have any question, please come on down. Thank you so much.